Hi, welcome to our channel Czech Globe. Today we would like to talk about causes of climate change and how is it connected to economics and politics. So, let's dig in. Thank you very much for coming here today.
Thank you for having me.
So could you maybe do a little self-introduction?
I'm Julia Leventon. I'm head of the Department of Human Dimensions of Global Change at Czech Globe. The research that we do in the department really looks at the social impacts and drivers of global change, like climate change and biodiversity loss. And we're really looking at ways that we can stop these processes of global change and adapt to those that are already happening. My own research looks at processes of transformation, so how we can change the systems that are driving global change.
Okay, so you mentioned the climate change. Is it only an ecological issue?
Not at all. I actually see it as a social issue. Of course, we see the impacts in what's happening to the physical, the natural world. So we can see the impacts to biodiversity, to drought, for example, to rainfall patterns, and of course to temperatures, global temperatures. But actually, to me, what's interesting about that is that it is fundamentally a problem that has social impacts around, for example, availability of drinking water, availability of food, public health impacts to people. And it's also fundamentally a problem that is caused by society. Without people driving emissions of carbon dioxide, then we don't have climate change. And so really when we talk about climate change, I see that as being a social issue.
Okay, and maybe could you name some issues for the climate change or the main causes of it?
What we do know is that there are emissions that drive this process of global warming. The two biggest ones that we talk about are carbon dioxide and methane for driving this greenhouse effect. But when I talk about it being a social problem, that's because these emissions are only generated by processes that we do as a society. So for example, our global agricultural systems, our food systems that produce, process and deliver food to us are big emitters of carbon dioxide. And that's through the way that we use land, for example, through deforestation to create agricultural land, through the kinds of fertilizers that we use, through the crops that we produce. Then the movement of this food around the globe, its processing, its packaging and its delivery to door. That all creates emissions. And particularly if we're talking about meat, for example, and the methane emissions from producing beef and animals for our own consumption. And the land required to produce the food to feed those animals, that all produces emissions that drive this process of global warming. We also can talk about the travel behaviours that we have, for example, using our cars, flying around the world, that all produces emissions. And basically everything we do every day, everything that we consume has emissions attached to it.
Okay, so you're saying that it's mainly a social issue, but is it somehow related to economy and politics?
Absolutely. What we do know from research is that the economy is a huge problem that's driving our behaviours. We live in a capitalist economy that is pursuing economic growth. And the global economy basically wants to grow and grow and grow and grow every year. That's what we're all pursuing. But there's a limit to what it can grow into. We have known this since the 70s when the first sort of UN reports about limits to growth came out. There is a limit to the natural carrying capacity of the planet. And so when we're talking about economic growth, it's sort of pushing against those limits right now and really stepping beyond those limits. We know that there are certain planetary boundaries or limits that have already been exceeded. For example, the amount of chemicals that are out in the biosphere, our carbon dioxide emissions, they're all in excess of what the planet can cope with. And that's why we're seeing the impacts of global warming and biodiversity loss at the moment. Fundamentally, if we're thinking about what that means for us, it's basically in this global economic system is pushing our behaviours, it's pushing us to consume more, and it's trapping us in ways of behaving. So when we think about our own behaviours and what we consume, we're being pushed to consume more and more in order to grow the economy. We're being pushed to work more and more. And we're being told to buy this, buy that, go on holiday here, travel there. And we're all acting with economic common sense. We buy the things that make most economic sense to us, that are cheaper for us. But actually, all of these behaviours are not very good for the environment. If we're wanting to buy meat, the volumes that we're buying meat, but we don't want to pay much money for it, that's pushing the people who produce meat to then produce it in an industrial way, to put lots of animals together in one building, to not really care about their welfare and to not really have an eye on the environmental consequences of that, of what they do with the waste, and how they manage the emissions from that plant. And the same can be seen, for example, in the way that we buy new electronics. They are planned to expire after 2 or 3 years, and we get rid of them and we buy new. Every time we do that, there is a consequence on the environment because it requires more materials to be put into the economy. It requires mining, energy, and consumption. And all of that has an environmental impact. So when we talk about the lack of sustainability in the world, it quite often comes down to this economic system that's driving our patterns of consumption.
Yeah, I see. And what about politics? Is it somehow related to this as well?
Yeah, I think these days it's really quite hard to separate politics and economics, right? Because actually, our decision makers, our politicians, are making decisions about how to steer that economy and how to steer us within it. So the two aren't really separable. The two things go hand in hand. But what we've got at the moment, the political decisions that we can make are really about how we steer that economy. What kind of regulations do we put in place? Do we make decisions that provide for society, or do we make decisions that provide for the companies and profit maximization? And there's a split there. If we are managing our economy to increase the incomes of our industries, then that's often at the expense of everyday people, all of us, really. A good example of this, I think, is that we can think about, for example, transport provision. One of the simplest things that we can all do to minimise emissions is to use public transport. And this is where economics and politics really intersect. Actually, across a lot of Europe, our public transport provisions have been outsourced to private companies. They've been sold off. Coming from Britain, this is a really good example of this, the privatisation of public transport in the UK, for example. So now the bus services are run by private companies. And it doesn't make economic sense for them to run frequent services to rural communities because there's not enough people using those services for them to make a profit. So they've then decided to cut those services. And so people in rural communities rely on having a car to get to places, to get to work, to do their shopping, to access services, healthcare, etc. So they now have to have a car. If we're now talking about managing the environment and cutting down people's personal car use, then the best thing that the politicians could do would be to say, okay, let's support public transport use. Let's subsidise that or make sure that there is infrastructure in place. But they no longer have that control because they've sold the transport companies off to private companies. And so they can't do that. They can't force these private sector actors to act in a way that's good for the environment. So they're having to make different decisions now. So in that way, this question of economics and politics, it's actually the same thing a lot of the time.